Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 185. This week the questions are taken from the Wednesday video on the 10th Light Flotilla, the Italian underwater specialists, and Guide 235 to the Tacoma class frigates or destroyer escorts of the US Navy. Let's get stuck in, shall we? Kurumi asks, why did the Japanese and Americans make large, approximately 2,400-ton displacement submarines while the Germans focused on smaller, less than 1,000-ton submarines? It seems like their philosophies aren't too different, raiding convoys in open waters. Well, it depends on exactly which subs you're looking at. Obviously, the Germans built a lot of Type 7s, but the Type 7s are not directly comparable to the Japanese Type A and Type B subs or the American fleet subs. For that, I think it's fairer to compare a Type 9. And when you compare a Type 9, which still displaces a significant amount less than a A or B type Japanese sub or a Gato or something, you see that for the when it comes to the American subs, it's mainly about speed. In fact, a Type 9 generally has longer range than a Gato, so it's not specifically the range when it comes to American versus German submarines, but the Gato can make a significantly faster surface transit than a Type 9 can, and it's also a little bit faster underwater. And depending on exactly which model you're looking at, there's variations in underwater endurance as well. But obviously, if you're going to go faster, you need to burn a lot more fuel, which means you need to carry a lot more fuel. And if you're going to go faster underwater, you also need a bigger battery pack. So it's primarily a propulsion thing for the Americans building much larger subs. Plus, of course, crew accommodation, because if you are building a fleet sub that's supposed to go long distances, especially in somewhere like the Pacific, as was covered in the first year of the US submarine campaign video, there's a lot of other extras that the US is putting into their subs, air conditioning and fire control computers, for example, and all of those require space as well, so that pushes the size of the sub up. When it comes to the Japanese, who tend to build the biggest submarines in large numbers during World War II and in the immediate run-up thereunto, there's a whole slew of factors. The Japanese subs on the surface are faster than either the American or German subs. They also have a significantly longer range than either of the other two, sort of in the order of 30 to 50% more range. And they also tend to carry aircraft, which neither the Type 9s nor the Gatos tend to do. So they've got an awful lot of stuff to fit in there, which ironically enough leads to the fact that despite them being the biggest subs, quite often you can find a Gato or a Type 9 carrying more torpedoes than a Japanese sub can, because they've got all this other extraneous stuff built into it, which is pushing the displacement up and taking up volume inside. So they are rather different designs. Merkava Mayhem asks, the Yamato was designed to fight two opponents at the same time and win. How would it fare in a fight against two treaty-era battleships? King George V, North Carolina, Richelieu, etc. Well, I'd say that's a little bit of a misnomer. The Yamatos were designed to fight any two US standard types. The Japanese were relatively confident the Yamato could take on a pair of treaty battleships as well, but the original design spec, when you look into what Yamato was designed to take on, was effectively the colarados, which, you know, good as they are, they're not quite as effective as a treaty-era ship. Nevertheless, should a Yamato end up in a fight with a pair of King George V's, a pair of North Carolinas, a pair of Richelieus, etc., etc., the main thing that you have to factor in, apart from the standard caveats of weather, radar, blah, 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 is that one-on-one, yes, Yamato is superior, Yamato should win. But 2v1, Yamato faces a bit of an interesting choice, because if it continues to fire with all guns on one ship, it has to hope that it gets hits in quickly enough that it very rapidly becomes a 1v1 fight, i.e. disable, at the very least, if not outright destroy, one of the two ships that is attacking it. But that's a bit of a gamble, because if it doesn't get the range quickly enough, or perhaps the hits that it does land aren't fatal, or at least massively crippling, then that gives an opportunity for both attacking treaty battleships to get the range, and once both get the range, well, one of them is completely unengaged, so it's probably going to get the range faster, at which point, whilst Yamato's armour might very well hold up against the incoming fire, all that second ship has to do is degrade its fighting capability by smashing up its command crew, destroying the rangefinders, fire control systems, and that kind of setting it on fire, that kind of thing. At which point, okay, the turrets still have their own rangefinders, there might be secondary backup systems, but they're not going to be as effective, and both treaty ships, or maybe just the one if only one of them survives, can make their way closer in to a point where their guns can overcome Yamato's armour. Albeit, obviously, they'd have to hope that they can disable at least one arc of Yamato's main armament, because, getting in close to the 18-inch guns when they can still fire at you is probably not a brilliant thing. So that's one way Yamato could try and fight them. The other way, of course, would be to split its fire. Perhaps if it decides, well, whichever ship we like the least, we're going to engage with the two front turrets, and we're going to assign the rear turret and maybe the 6-inch guns, if the range is short enough, to engage the other target. Now, in that case, both targets are under fire. Obviously, whichever ship is being targeted by the single 18-inch turret has an advantage, because 3-gun salvos are somewhat difficult to spot for range. But it's a much better chance for Yamato to engage in this manner, I think, than engaging just 1v1 and hoping the other one doesn't get the range in time. It is still a difficult ask, just because of the sheer number of guns that are coming. I mean, minimum case, with something like a Richelieu, you've got 16 guns being fired at you. The middle case with the North Carolina or some other 3 triple turret design, you're looking at 18 guns being fired at you, and of course with King George V's you have 20 guns being fired at you, and sooner or later some of those hits are going to start telling. So Yamato is in this interesting position whereby it's one of the few ships where you can conceivably see it, well, not happily, but comfortably engaging a pair of treaty battleships and coming out on top if a few dice go it the correct way. But compared to fighting a pair of standards, where it also will have a speed advantage, whereas against treaty battleships it either won't or perhaps they'll have the speed advantage if it's something like a Richelieu, it's a much tougher ask. There's enough firepower, enough speed, and enough accuracy upon range-finding conditions in a pair of treaty battleships that, whilst it's difficult to argue that both of them will survive, and it's certainly almost impossible to argue that both of them are going to survive in good condition, at least one of them is going to end up badly damaged, if not sunk, Yamato's overall fighting capability stands a fairly good chance of being degraded quite quickly. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, you mentioned that the Tacomas were built with vertical triple expansion engines. If these were obsolete by World War I, why were they still being used on warships built in World War II? Was it because they were built to merchant specs, limited availability of turbines, or other reasons? And was it common for other escort classes to use triple expansion engines in World War II? It was actually somewhat common. The main reasons are that turbines are very good, when compared to vertical triple expansion engines, at running smoothly and consistently for prolonged periods of time at high speed. So this is why they're used first in destroyers, and then obviously in things like Dreadnought, and then it develops through to the rest of the various navies' fleets. Escorts for convoys don't need to move at that kind of high speed, so the use case or the justification for turbines is a little bit less. There's also the factor that these navies are expanding very rapidly, and a lot of merchant ships, who again are not travelling particularly fast, are still powered by vertical or triple expansion engines. And so if you're taking in large amounts of sailors, then statistically speaking, the average trained sailor, bearing in mind there's going to be a lot more merchant sailors than there are naval sailors when it comes to engine room staff, are going to know how to operate a vertical triple expansion engine with relatively minimal additional training, as opposed to a turbine. So there's that to account for. But perhaps the most prosaic reason, and actually the main one, is because the production of turbines, especially the gearing and the turbine blades, is an industrial bottleneck that none of the Allied countries could actually fully solve. So you could build everything else about the ships, but if you chose to make them turbine powered, producing that many turbine gear sets and that many turbines, it was beyond even the industrial capacity of the United States to supply, given that they were also building huge numbers of turbines and gear sets for everything else that they were building in terms of larger warships, Fletcher class and upwards, plus obviously the fact that you had to repair and replace engines that were being worn out or combat damaged. So vertical triple expansion engines didn't require the same industrial processes that formed that bottleneck, and thus it was easier to manufacture them on a completely separate line and install them on these smaller ships that didn't need the high-speed features of a geared turbine set in order to just get ships out in the water. Gelskull asks, why did Britain only build, or was only allowed to build, 2 Nelsons, whereas the Americans had 3 Colorados and Japan was at parity with Britain with the Nagatos? As far as I can tell, this reason. Yes, Longship is so long it only fits the tail end of it in this particular photo, but that is, of course, the stern of HMS Hood. And I think that's pretty much why Britain only got the 2 Nelsons, because, yeah, by the 553 or 15-15-10, whatever you want to call it, ratio, theoretically, for everything to be equal, Britain should have had 3 16-inch ships to match the US 16-inch ships, and the Japanese should have had 2. But, I mean, you can make arguments about maybe the Queen Elizabeth were rated higher or not, but I think really the elephant in the room is Hood. It's bigger than anything else that is around as a capital ship, and whilst it does get derided, in many cases unfairly, because of what happened to it in the Second World War, the fact is that everybody at the time rated Hood incredibly highly. The British obviously did. They built the thing. But it's very interesting, as I mentioned at previous Drydock recently, when you look at the American reports when Hood went over to the States in 1919, 1920, and drawings and reports were produced, the US looked at Hood and went, Hood is flat out more powerful than every battleship we have except for the Colorados, and the only time the Colorados have an edge is if you consider firepower and protection at the complete exclusion of speed. And if you include speed, Hood is more powerful than anything we've got. So you can imagine when the US is negotiating the Washington Naval Treaty, Hood's built and in service, they know there's precious little chance of persuading the British to scrap the thing. So then if Hood is this kind of in advance of everything else ship that the British have, it makes sense to think about it in the way of effectively Hood being the third 16-inch ship, even if it isn't actually armed with 16-inch guns. So you consider that the trifecta of big modern ships that everyone thinks they've got, the Japanese have Nagato and Mutsu, the US has Maryland, West Virginia and Colorado, and the British have Hood, Nelson and Rodney. And to be honest, as far as I think the Americans and the Japanese are concerned, this was probably a winning proposition, given that the initial British argumentation was that they wanted to complete a pair of G3s. Can you imagine a pair of G3s named Nelson and Rodney plus Hood instead of the historical Nelsons? Yeah. Alan Carey asks, I've seen someone insist that the Australian, Canadian, New Zealand and even US navies are all older than their respective countries because they're born from, or more or less take their traditions from, the Royal Navy. Now, I'd concede the Australian navy's a little muddy because of the colonial navies prior to Federation, but can you really say these navies are older than their countries simply because they come from the Royal Navy? I don't think that's a very strong argument for most navies. Although it could apply in some, and there's a questionable side argument in others. So, for example, with New Zealand, there were ships that had significant New Zealand crew, and there were ships that had majority New Zealand crew, in the Royal Navy before the Royal New Zealand Navy was formed. So I would not suggest that that constitutes a Royal New Zealand Navy before there is New Zealand. It is part of the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy is still a continuing entity. So you could argue, say, for something like New Zealand, that perhaps they had a naval tradition before New Zealand itself existed as a country, when it was still a dominion, or even before that, maybe a colony. So that would be kind of the middling argument. Other nations, the US, no, I don't think you can claim the US Navy is older than its country of origin. And the same for the Canadian Navy, because prior to either country getting independence, although obviously several hundred years apart, the Royal Navy presence in that area was provided by things like the North America Station. It wasn't even like in Australia where there was an Australian squadron. It was just the North American Station, supplemented by the West Indies Station, and obviously they renamed and rejigged the stations and squadrons all the time. But there wasn't a United States of America Station, there wasn't a separate Canadian Station or squadron or whatever. So it was just an outpost that the Royal Navy was at. So I don't think in those cases you could really claim that there was a Royal Canadian Navy or a United States Navy before they existed as countries. In fact, the United States Navy didn't exist for a while, even when the United States was a country. With Canada, again, you might be able to claim, a little bit like New Zealand, that there was a Canadian naval tradition going before Canada became independent enough to form its own navy. But that'd be stretching it. Australia, as you mentioned, it has the separate colonial navies, then it has a Commonwealth or sort of joint navy, and then it has the Royal Australian Navy. So I think Australia definitely can claim its own separate lineage of navy prior to Australia itself technically coming into existence. And funnily enough, probably the one you can make the strongest case for having a navy before it officially came into existence as in its current iteration as a country is probably actually India, because there was a separate Indian navy distinct from the Royal Navy for quite some time before India was granted its independence after World War II. So India can probably make an argument that the current Indian Navy has a distinct tradition and existence that predates the actual country itself in its current form. But I think of all the major British colonies, that's probably the only one where you can be definitive about it. Deeks25 asks, exceptionally long lifespans seem to be a frequent theme of Allied-built ships, even among supposed cheap mass-production ships such as the Tacomas, Flowers and Rivers. Do you think this propensity for build quality at every level of the fleet is a factor that gave the Allied navies an advantage over their Axis counterparts? I think we do have to be a little bit careful in terms of accidentally putting cart before horse when it comes to these kind of arguments. That's not to say that the Tacomas, Flowers and Rivers weren't well built and other Allied ships weren't well built, because in most cases they were. But equally there are various instances of ships being reported as not being particularly well built. I think the exceptionally long lifespans amongst Allied warships tend to come from two factors. One is that they won, so they tended to break the other side's ships, and there weren't that many of them left, which tended to mean shorter lifespans for Axis warships or Central Powers warships post-war. And comparatively, the winning powers, their ships are going to stick around because there's a lot of them, and there's no reason to scrap or scuttle them. And secondly, because they produced so many of them, and they would produce ships almost right up until the end of the war, and in some cases beyond, depending on the production line, you ended up with ships where Some of them were practically brand new, still in the wrapping, and therefore had a very long peacetime existence ahead of them as long as you want to keep them running. A lot of the stuff that was the most mass-produced was also small and cheap, which lent itself to be very attractive to keep running, especially amongst medium and smaller navies. And of course, because there were so many of them, it meant there was a ready supply of spare parts to keep them going, whereas what was left of Central Powers or Axis navies might keep on going for a little bit, but it would be relatively uneconomical to run one or two unique ships that need spare parts from a completely different country or their own specialist factory, as opposed to running ships where, there's 300 of them scattered across the planet, so you can get a spare part in almost every port. Plus, of course, their Axis or Central Power ships are usually have been quite heavily worn during the war, because there weren't that many of them, certainly by the end of the war. But, as well as obviously quantity having a quality all of its own, there is a degree of merit to what you're talking about in that by mass-producing ships and having well-established, heavily embedded industries, even for the production of larger ships that maybe didn't get mass series production, such as battleships, it does mean that there is a sort of a certain minimum set of fit and finish to Allied warships that, as long as they've not got too many miles on the clock by the time that peacetime comes, does generally tend to ensure that they will last an exceptionally long time. The big unknown, of course, is that how well would German or Japanese or Italian warships have lasted if they'd been given the chance post-war. To a certain degree, we have a bit of an answer, because quite a number of Italian ships did survive the war, and some of them did stick around for quite a while. German ships, on the other hand, most of the Kriegsmarine ended up at the bottom of the sea by the end of the war, and so did most of the Japanese Navy. Although then again, much as we might look at sort of how long a Fletcher-class or Daring-class destroyer stayed in service, the one or two Japanese destroyers that went off as war prizes also stick around for quite a while. I think a lot of the time, as I said earlier, it depends more on how many miles on the clock does that particular hull have by the end of the war, and how many of its sister ships are still around to act as sources of spare parts and manufacturing. Soviet Blobfish asks, would you say Army-Navy rivalry was a distinct phenomenon in Japan, or was it more just both the Army and Navy being chaotically infighting in places generally? So there was a degree of internal fighting in the Japanese Army and a degree of internal fighting in the Japanese Navy, but the Army-Navy rivalry was very, very distinct, very much a lines drawn in the sand thing beyond most inter-service rivalry. Because, inter-service rivalry exists everywhere. The RAF grabbed the Fleet Air Arm for the better part of the interwar period. The Regia Aeronautica and the Regia Marina got on about as well as a pair of rabid dogs don't. Hermann Goering famously wanted to control every single thing that flew in the Kriegsmarine, regardless of whether it was the squadrons on an aircraft carrier or the Arado 196s being launched off of a catapult on a cruiser, and so on and so on and so forth. So, Army, Navy, Army, Air Force, Navy, Army, Navy, Air Force rivalries, they're all over the world in almost every branch of the military, but the Japanese phenomena was a bit more distinct, both in terms of its literal viciousness at times, but also because compared to most other nations, certainly at the time, the Japanese Army and Navy had a lot more direct political influence, and they had a lot more history going further back in that's external to their roles as the maritime and land-based defense forces of their country, in terms of things like being originated largely out of two different samurai clans who hated each other for completely different reasons to the fact that they were now the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy, and as I said, the direct political influence that they had, which lent all of that infighting a particularly nasty edge to it. Joe Arnold asks, in the end, were destroyers a success in their originally intended role? I know they found new uses, but it seems like in every naval story from the 20th century you get at least one bit where destroyers launch a bunch of fruitless torpedoes. Just how many naval ships larger than themselves were successfully sunk by destroyers? Well, I'd say in their original role, the torpedo boat destroyer was incredibly successful because they kind of wiped out the idea of seagoing torpedo boats fairly quickly. The only times you really see torpedo boats on the high seas recurring thereafter is when places like Italy and Japan try to rebuild torpedo boat fleets, and Germany as well for that matter, which kind of try and dodge around the treaties for a bit, and then they inevitably grow to the size of small destroyers eventually, but that's kind of a separate issue. But in terms of the role that they came to adopt after they exterminated the torpedo boat, or the seagoing variant thereof, by proxy, yeah, destroyers launch a lot more torpedoes than they actually hit, but in terms of ships larger than themselves that were sunk by destroyers, there's a fair amount. I mean, there's a lot more that were damaged by destroyers or that were killed by destroyers with torpedoes in conjunction with other ships. Scharnhorst being a good example of that latter one. But, near the conclusion of the Battle of Jutland, SMS Pommern, pre-dreadnought battleship, destroyed by destroyer torpedoes. A good chunk of ABDA command, including 2 Dutch cruisers at the Battle of the Java Sea, destroyed by destroyer torpedoes. You've got USS Northampton, destroyed by Japanese destroyer torpedoes at the Battle of Tassafaronga. USS Helena met her end at the Battle of Kula Gulf. That's the Brooklyn-class variant. So, there's a fair number of surface ships sunk directly by destroyer torpedoes. And then, as I said, you get into, this ship was sunk. Destroyer torpedoes were a fairly big part of that, but there was also some surface gunfire involved, and so on and so forth. So, and plus all the damages. So, I'd say they're fairly successful. Granted, as yes, a lot of the torpedoes don't actually do all that much, but then that's also a reflection of how dangerous they actually are, because the destroyer attack is taken so seriously, ships are covered in secondary guns to see them off and surrounded by escorts, including other destroyers, to see them off. And so you end up with this massive, ecosystem growing up, which in large part is there just to counter the threat of the torpedo-armed destroyer. HS asks, besides the Japanese, did anyone develop or design weapons beyond a 16-inch caliber? And how effective would these weapons have been compared to a 16-inch? HMS Furious is not happy that you have forgotten about it. So yes, there were a number of nations that either developed or designed weapons beyond 16-inch. The Germans did, the British did, and the Americans did. Now, how successful they would have been is a slightly different matter. Furious's gun, as you can see here, with a little bit of editing, was fine as a bombardment weapon, but it was a 40 caliber weapon. Even at the time, it didn't offer a spectacular amount for ship-to-ship combat, especially considering that as designed there were only ever 2 of them, and as built, Furious only ever carried the 1. The British did have a more advanced 18-inch gun design, which was going to be fitted to the N3s. Some utter genius was in the process of trying to work out a 20-inch gun for the incomparables. The Americans looked at 18-inch guns. The Germans looked at 16.5-inch guns at the least, and possibly larger. But aside from Furious's 18-inch guns, no one else's greater than 16-inch weapons went to sea. In terms of how effective they would have been compared to a 16-inch, well, it depends what 16-inch you're looking at. Colorado's 16-inch, Nagato's 16-inch, Nelson's 16-inch, South Dakota's 16-inch, Iowa's 16-inch. They're all quite different, but generally speaking, 18-inch guns were beginning to push the limits of what most navies consider to be practical, the occasional foray into 20-inch guns aside, largely on the basis of weight, because weight was going up almost exponentially thanks to the square cube law, and also rate of fire. Because whilst, as we've discussed in many dry docks, getting the rate of fire much past a couple of rounds a minute is really a little bit of a hiding to nothing, because the average rate of fire in most battles is about 1 round per minute. It does offer you a certain degree of flexibility, because when it comes to rapid fire, you have that ability there. And also it means that if your loading cycle can be completed in 30 seconds and you're only being expected to do it in 60 seconds, then it's a much more relaxed, less labor-intensive firing cycle, and you can probably keep that up for a long time. Whereas if you can only just about get your gun loaded once a minute, or even once every 45 seconds, then your margins are a lot tighter for your typical engagement, and you don't have that reserve of rapid fire to fall back on if you happen to need it. And most navies recognise that between that and the weight issues, you would have to build a phenomenally large ship to fit a reasonable number of 18-inch guns on. And so for those reasons, they tended, N3 designs and such like aside, to shy away from the 18-inch and larger weapon. But they also acknowledge that an individual 18-inch shell hit would do a lot more damage and generally have a lot more armor penetration than a comparable 16-inch gun of the same generation from the same country. So, broadly, the 18-inch of any given country at any given time would have been more powerful compared to the 16-inch, thus technically on a gun-per-gun basis more effective. But you would have either had to build a much larger, more expensive ship, or accept lesser numbers of the guns. And with the issues around loading and firing the things, that's why most of the time the choice was made to prefer more numerous 16-inch as opposed to fewer 18-inch. Brendan Buersdorf asks, "Hello, Drac. I hope this comment finds you well. To a greater or lesser degree. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the Ottoman ironclad Mesudiye." Okay, yeah. Mesudiye has a weird service history. She's also, the poster child for modernizations before modernizations were cool. So she started life in 1872, believe it or not. Well, you probably can believe it looking at this, as a central battery ironclad. So far so good, part of the Ottoman Empire's various attempts in the 19th century at rearming itself and getting itself taken seriously. And for a while it was a very powerful ship. And then everything went to pieces again, because the funding dried up, training collapsed, and the last couple of decades of the 19th century saw the Ottoman Navy basically degrade back into the state it had pretty much been in before the wave of building that had included Mesudiye. Then, at the turn of the century, the Ottomans decided to try doing this whole navy thing once again. Except, of course, they didn't have massive amounts of money. What they did have was some old ships. And they decided, well, maybe we can rebuild some of our old ships as well as ordering new ones, and that might help. And so this, at this point, practically 30-year-old ironclad was sent toddling off to Genoa to see what the Italians could do with her. And boy, could the Italians do something with her. She was almost completely rebuilt on a scale that was probably even more ambitious than what the Italians would later do with the Cavours and Duilios. And she emerged looking something like this. And if you're wondering, yes, they did basically manage to turn an ironclad into something that vaguely resembled a pre-dreadnought. It wasn't entirely a true pre-dreadnought. Now, granted, it went from 1 screws to 2. It went from very basic steam engines to triple expansion. It went from 14 knots to 17. That was all very impressive. The armour layout, however, did remain the same, which technically makes Mesudiye the world's only ironclad pre-dreadnought, because she retained, as far as anyone can tell, her 12 inches of iron armour. So probably not necessarily something you want to take into combat against actual pre-dreadnoughts, but might do reasonably well against cruisers for the most part. Her guns were completely replaced. Instead of having a central battery layout, ironclad layout, instead you can see that was partially directly replaced with quick-firing guns, which were also scattered elsewhere on the ship. And the ship's main weaponry became a pair of 9.2-inch guns in a pair of turrets fore and aft, and most of the sails, well, all the sails and all but one of the masts went away. Now, this loss, the main armour was somewhat notional. Because, unless you're maybe roughly contemporary German pre-dreadnoughts, a gun of this caliber isn't technically a battleship weapon. It's more of an armoured cruiser weapon, but she certainly wasn't fast enough to be called an armoured cruiser. Plus the slight complication that they didn't actually install the guns. They put some wooden dummies in place, which really did make her more like a slow armoured cruiser, particularly something like a Monmouth class, because she was just covered in quick-firing 6-inch guns and smaller weapons and nothing much else doing. Weirdly enough, they did put the turrets on, and since the turrets were new, they had steel armour, so although their actual protection thickness was thinner than the main belt, being, face-hardened steel armour, technically the best armoured portion of Mesudiye was the turrets and no longer the belt. But with her wooden imitation main guns and considerable secondary and tertiary battery, Mesudiye then re-entered the Ottoman fleet as this very bizarre hybrid vessel and proceeded to fight the Greeks, which didn't go particularly well for it, or the Ottomans in general. And then in World War I, it went off to fight the Allies, which also didn't go particularly well for the poor thing in general. I mean, it wandered around being a ship of some description until the relatively early in the war, a few months after it started, a British submarine spotted it, fired a torpedo, and no matter how much rebuilding effort you'd done, it still was an ironclad at heart. So, rather unsurprisingly, a torpedo to what was effectively the hull, minus a few bits of bow and stern changes, of an 1870s ironclad didn't stand up to the modern weaponry all that well, and Mesudiye fairly rapidly capsized and sank, albeit that not that many people actually lost their lives in the attack. Patrick J asks, in your most recent video covering HMS Devastation, I noticed how low its freeboard was, and how that seemed to be a trend in warship design for a time in the 1860s and 1870s. Can you discuss the logic behind this and the impact on seakeeping? Higher freeboards both preceded and succeeded it, so how did it get there? Ah yes, good old Devastation, when your battle ensign has more freeboard than your ship does. Well, there was a certain degree of logic to it. The logic came from two factors. One of which was that guns had gotten powerful enough that armour was having to reach truly absurd levels of thickness. And thus armour was becoming very heavy. The idea at the time was that the ship's, at least the ship's citadel, if not the entire length of the ship, should be protected by armour. Bear in mind this is the days pre-massively divided bulkhead doors for the most part, at least compared to what we'd understand bulkhead division to be in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so if you were going to fully armour the sides of the hull with 12, 14, 18 or 20 inches of iron, well, you're not going to be taking that up very high, because then you're going to start running into some buoyancy issues. So that made the hull fairly low in the water. Secondly, bearing in mind these ships are still not very large compared to the weight of armour and the weight of guns they're carrying. As the guns themselves get larger, and of course they're in big heavily armoured biscuit tin type turrets, if you put those turrets too high up in the ship, you're going to have stability issues and end up rolling over and sinking horribly. So to have turreted guns at that point, you need to mount them fairly low in the ship, and the armour means your hull's not going to be very high anyway unless you want large amounts of unprotected hull, and so you end up with ships like Devastation. And bearing in mind, obviously, that the actual ship's hull is more along the lines of freeboard of what you can see there on the quarterdeck aft. Some of what you can see coming further forward is the breastwork, which was, for the most part, separately armoured, but is distinct from the ship's hull itself, and you can see not a tremendous amount of freeboard is gained. This gradually crept up, I should say, slightly due to seakeeping concerns, but it only really went away again when you had things like, well, starting with compound armor where you could get slightly better protection for less thickness, and then really the breakthroughs of Harvey and Krupp steel, which suddenly allowed for a much thinner plate of armor to provide as good or better protection as previous armor had done, and thus with the sudden reduction in weight compared to square foot coverage of armor, you could make protected gun turrets which could be mounted higher in the ship. You could cover much larger portions of the ship's hull with meaningful armor, and all of a sudden you get effectively the pre-dreadnought. The impact on seakeeping, it depended on how well you designed the ship. The breastwork, for example, on Devastation and a number of her other, not sister ships, that was just Thunderer, but other related vessels, was in part designed to help with seakeeping by keeping the sea away from swamping the ship completely. But it also came down to how well you designed air vents and uptakes and intakes, which again is part of what the breastwork is there to help with. Devastation was surprisingly a pretty good seaboat by most standards. The big vulnerabilities, her boilers and air intakes, were mounted on top of the breastwork, so that kept them clear of the worst of the weather. And whilst, in theory, she would be a fairly lively ship, the fact that she had such a low freeboard meant that while you might otherwise, looking at her calculation, think she's going to roll quite sharply and violently, the sea itself, by washing over her, tended to damp out her rolling a bit, which made her weirdly stable. It would have been very bad news if any of the hatches had given way, but it kind of worked, even if it was a little bit slow as a result. What you effectively had was a positive free surface effect going instead of the negative one you usually get associated with flooding. But, there were limits to that, and seakeeping ultimately was better if you could have a higher freeboard, especially if you wanted to retain any kind of significant speed. So once the advances in armor metallurgy came through, this kind of approach was dropped for pretty much anything except monitors. Trevor Polasek asks, were types of shot other than solid shot, i.e. grape shot, chain shot, etc., common on Age of Sail warships, and how did gunners know when to load what shot? Yes, different types of shot apart from the solid cannonball were common on Age of Sail warships, but the common cannonball was by far the most common. So, it depends on exactly which ship you're looking at, but well over 50% of the magazine capacity of any Age of Sail warship would just simply be cannonballs. But, say, for a first-rate like Victory, you would have several hundred rounds of canister shot or grape shot, several hundred rounds of bar and chain shot or star shot or whatever people happen to want to use in the terms of the whirly, decapitatey, rip holes in sails type of shot. There's quite a few different varieties of it. So everyone would be able to see them, everyone would know where they were, they'd be available in quantities enough to give quite a few broadsides, but that wouldn't compare to the literally thousands of cannonballs that were present. In terms of how did the gunners know when to load what shot, in a regular battle, there would be small quantities of the slightly unusual forms of shot stacked around in the area, as well as large numbers of cannonballs, obviously. So if you needed the occasional canister or bar salvo, you could call for it fairly quickly. But in terms of when the gunners knowing when to load which shot, that's where you had to listen out for the midshipmen, and then everyone and the other men and low-ranking officers assigned to the various gun decks, because obviously most of the time, unless it was a general action, you would fire in broadsides. So if everybody fires at roughly the same time, and it takes at least 30 seconds to reload, if not more, that gives plenty of time for a captain who's ordering the broadside in the first place to decide what his next salvo is going to be made up of, relay that to the various people in the various gun decks, and then they will yell down, load canister or load grape or load bar shot or whatever. Because remember, when a cannon comes in board having fired, the first thing you need to do is swap it out and get rid of any burning fragments of the previous shot. So while you're doing that, there's time for orders to be given to say, right now you need to fire this kind of shot, and people then pick that up, stuff that in, and off they go. In a more general engagement where it's just, effectively fire at will, then, okay, at that point you might need to consider, what kind of shot you're going to fire. That could be down to the individual gun crews, but at that point it's just easier to just chuck cannonballs in. If you are, especially on the upper deck gun crew, you might see boarding actions coming in and so forth, and at that point you might think, yeah, okay, I'm going to probably maybe stick a canister or grape in there, but that would be very much at your own initiative. Patrick Donnelly asks, considering the Imperial Japanese Navy's emphasis on night combat, how come they didn't develop a night carrier doctrine prior to or during World War II? And how would the war in the Pacific have been affected if it did? For the most part, it was a technological issue as far as I can tell. The Japanese Navy certainly didn't neglect the idea of night flying. A lot of their land-based attack units, twin-engine bombers for the most part, were entirely capable of night flying. Indeed, the Battle of Rennell Island, one of the last actions in the Guadalcanal campaign, was initiated on the Japanese side almost entirely by night-flying Japanese bombers. But the two fundamental things that allowed the British to develop night carrier doctrine relatively early, and then would later allow the Americans to develop it as well, were airborne radar to help find the targets, and the correct forms of radio telemetry beacons to allow aircraft to find the carriers again and make their way home. And these were things that the Japanese did not have quite the same level of technical capability in the immediate interwar period and then during the start of the war. By the time they got to a point where they probably could have had all of those things, they were really much on the back foot and didn't really have much of a carrier arm to speak of, let alone a night fighting one. But as I said, where those could be overcome by having land-based bombers, who therefore didn't need to find a moving home base and so forth, then they did run night ops, and they would obviously run night fighters in trying to defend their cities towards the end of the war. This is a Japanese night fighter you can see there. Now, if the Japanese had managed to develop a night carrier doctrine prior to World War II, I mean, again, it's not going to save the Japanese, because if their night carrier doctrine starts to be a major problem for the Americans, well, then the Americans will accelerate the development of their own and probably turn around to the British and say, hey, you lot, you've got a working night carrier doctrine, teach us how to do it ASAP, otherwise the Japanese are going to keep sinking our ships, which is irritating. So it's not going to win the war for Japan, but it could make the early part of the war a lot more bloody for the Allies, and perhaps less costly for the Japanese, because let's say, Coral Sea, much of a muchness. Before that, the Japanese have pretty much had most of the battles going their way. So you're really looking at Midway and Guadalcanal. Now, Midway, it's not going to save them all that much because they didn't know the American carriers were there. So Midway's going to go the way that Midway does. But when it comes to the Guadalcanal campaign, perhaps a night carrier doctrine really could have helped them there, because they had limited numbers of carriers. The Americans had limited numbers of carriers. But of course, even though the Japanese came off somewhat the better at, say, Santa Cruz, in terms of ships sunk, their air groups got utterly shredded. Now, part of that, to be fair, was helped by radar, but in 1942, the vast majority of anti-aircraft fire control is still largely working off of optical systems, and they don't work very well at night for obvious reasons. At which point, if, say, the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands or the Battle of the Eastern Solomons had involved the Japanese showing up at 2 a.m. with torpedo and dive bomber strikes, then A, they would have inflicted more damage on the Americans, but B, perhaps more crucially, they wouldn't have taken quite as many casualties. at which point the Japanese carrier arm and its air wings survive going on further. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, there is a nascent night doctrine developing amongst American carriers to a limited degree. But if the Japanese have a full night doctrine, obviously, as we said, that will probably be accelerated. And I think, well, the Japanese, if they had a night carrier doctrine, probably would have been incredibly tempted to use it at the Battle of the Philippine Sea as a way to leverage an advantage over the Americans. And of course, the Americans would have had to respond to that. So that could have turned into an utterly vicious engagement if you'd had an accelerated American night program, probably just about stretching its legs in terms of full carrier deployments, versus a somewhat more experienced, somewhat higher survival rate Japanese Navy strike force, and everybody's engaging in full-on night fighter combat, night fighters attacking strike aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, trying to work out in some way, shape or form what the heck is going on and who to shoot at. It would have been a complete and utter disaster and a mess, but it might have been a very, very intriguing battle to see. John McDonough asks, I recently read an eyewitness account of the Battle of Lake Erie by Samuel R. Brown. He was an American officer of the Light Dragoons who witnessed the battle from shore and visited the fleet the following day. In his account he states, the killed of both fleets were thrown overboard as fast as they fell. Is this accurate? Were the dead treated as so much wreckage and debris to be cleared? And when did this change to the elaborate efforts to collect, identify and bury at sea the dead that we see from the 20th century onwards? I don't know exactly how accurate it is, because different sources about the Battle of Lake Erie, some of them describe the dead being thrown overboard in battle, as you mentioned, and others describe the dead being thrown overboard immediately after the battle with relatively minimal ceremony, but with the, at the time, standard sailor in hammock, sew up hammock, put weight in it, and over the side they go. So exactly which one is accurate and which one may be a conflation or a smoothing out of the other, not entirely sure. But, in the age of sail, unless you were a very high-ranking officer, and sometimes not even then, if you died in battle, they didn't really have anything to preserve you in. Let's say, unless you happened to be Nelson and you had a handy cask of brandy nearby. So you were going to end up being buried at sea unless the ship was about to put into port immediately thereafter, or could put into at least a harbour, maybe an island or something. In which case, if they could, they'd prefer to bury the dead on land, but quite often they couldn't, and you can't really keep dead bodies around on an age of sail warship for all that long before that causes some fairly serious health complications. And everyone understood that. So, when it changed to, collect, identify and bury at sea the dead that in the way we see from the 20th century, I don't think it really did. With modern conflict, if you call early 20th century conflict modern, there's a little bit more time in the immediate aftermath, usually, unless the ship's obviously massively on fire or whatever. But the ceremonies are broadly the same as what you'd see on most Asia-for-sail ships. Now, the fact that there's even a confusion as to whether the dead were thrown overboard in battle or afterwards is somewhat unusual, in that confusion exists for Lake Erie. And if they were doing that at Lake Erie, and with obviously the heavy caveat if, I can kind of understand why, in as much as the Lake Erie fight, like many of the fights on the various Great Lakes, consisted of small ships with small crews and small deck areas. Now, if you're on a ship of the line and someone is killed, well, they might be badly wounded. You take them below to the orlop deck or something, and they might die there, in which case they can be quietly popped out of the way until you can deal with them afterwards. Or if they're killed straight out on the gun deck or on the upper decks, the decks are large enough that, again, you probably are just going to either let the body lie where it fall, or possibly just nudge it into an area that's not in an immediate movement path, because you don't really have the time or the energy to do much else. But on a brig or a schooner or a very, very small frigate, as you'd often see in the lake battles, the square cube law obviously working in reverse as you get smaller, there's very little deck space compared to human-sized people. I don't know what other kind of sized person you get, but never mind. Yeah, there's not a lot of available deck space comparatively. So if somebody dies, probably in a fall of debris as well, having a person just fall over dead on a brig might well block up maybe one side's passageway up and down the main gun deck. At which point, sorry, but if it's impeding the passage of everybody else trying to still fight the ship, or just chucking you overboard, you're probably going overboard. They wouldn't have liked to do it, and it'd probably be a thing that's only done in extreme circumstances, but I can see it happening for this kind of action. Vokir asks, I just received my copy of Shattered Sword. Congratulations. Can you briefly go further into the various ideas for Japanese operations outlined on page 26 and 27, and which do you think would have been the most effective? Yeah, so the final option is obviously the one they go for, trying to go across in the Central Pacific, which culminates in the Battle of Midway. But the other three main options that the Japanese were considering was go on the defensive, invade Australia, or go after the Solomon Islands and the various other islands just to the northeast of Australia and cut off its supply and communications routes. Of those, going on the defensive probably had the most long-term effectiveness, because that would allow the Japanese to repair and consolidate their ships. It wouldn't put their ships at too much risk. It would allow them to obviously strengthen the fleet with new ships coming in instead of replacing war losses. It would allow them to rebuild and reinvigorate their carrier air groups, which were already showing some signs of strain under the losses they'd taken. So it would have meant that the Japanese fleet stayed a considerable and powerful foe that actually had the numbers advantage over the US well into 1942, as opposed to obviously the catastrophic damage that the carrier fleet took at the Battle of Midway. But that is still only a matter of delaying the inevitable, and it means that the perimeter that the US went in to push at is pretty much the historical perimeter that they'd be dealing with. Attacking Australia directly, well, as you can see from the maximum advance that the Japanese managed, in theory is possible, but in practice it's really going to make the logistics very difficult, because as you can see, the Japanese never quite finished capturing all of New Guinea, and if they're expected to supply the entirety of multi-division invasion of Australia, well, assuming the emus and the other local wildlife don't get them, there's an awful lot of Australia, which is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, the Australians can't defend everywhere, so the Japanese having a fairly unopposed landing somewhere is a fairly high chance. On the other hand, that somewhere could be practically anywhere, and even if you capture somewhere like Darwin, well, great, now what? What are you going to do? March to Sydney? March to Canberra? Well, you're going to march anywhere in Australia when people are shooting back at you and you're at the tail end of a very long logistics line? Don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So, yeah, nice in theory. Would certainly put the cat amongst the pigeons with the Allies, but probably a very good way to lose an awful lot of Japanese army lives, which may have been actually a recommendation when it comes to the Japanese Navy. The final option, though, going for the Eastern Solomons area and the Solomon Island chain, etc., effectively early, i.e. prior to the historical Guadalcanal campaign, that, I think, probably makes the most sense from a long-term strategic perspective, because it means if you take the entire Kido Butai in and launch this attack, you are doing so with what's pretty much overwhelming strength. You're doing so in such a way that forces the Allies to respond at a time when they're really not in a shape to do so, and then you'll have Henderson Field and Guadalcanal and all those other wonderful things, which means, as the plan envisaged, you can cut off the supply lines to Australia and start attacking Australia with aircraft directly. Obviously, the supply line to Australia can't be entirely cut. It is possible to just go further south for American lines of communication, and of course, British ships coming in from the west are unaffected. But it is going to make life a lot more difficult. And I think overall that's probably the would have been their best option, because there's not a lot that I can see the Allies doing in May 1942 had the Japanese suddenly decided to thrust south that way. It would have been a very long distance commitment for the American carrier fleet. Granted, they might have brought Saratoga into the mix, so all 3 Yorktowns plus Saratoga might have been able to go down. But by the time that was all ready, who knows, Shikaku and Zuikaku, or at least one of them, might have been back in action. And you would have had the Japanese definitely expecting the Americans to come. So the surprise element that you got at Midway would also have been somewhat ruined. And it would have taken a while to clear them, because if the Japanese are fully bedded in on Guadalcanal, we can look at the absolutely horrific cost and grind it took to clear places like Tinian, Saipan, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. And now imagine Guadalcanal at the start of the war, when the Americans don't have the level of shore bombardment, they don't have the level of carrier air support, and they don't have the level of amphibious experience that they would have and be able to apply to those other fortress areas. So that, in terms of prolonging the war, that was probably would have been the best option for the Japanese. You create a very difficult to crack grinding area that the Americans have to feed troops into to try and, reopen the direct communications and supply lines with Australia. And because it's mostly a land war, especially with Henderson Field being firmly in Japanese hands for the most part, it allows most of the benefits of a defensive war thereafter in terms of regrouping and consolidating your carriers and your other ships and strengthening the fleet. Sinar asks, in your recent report on USS Arizona, you did a wonderful job relating the reports and creating a great picture of what seems to have happened. Oh, thank you. How do they apply this sort of information, as it's clearly important enough for them to spend the time and resources to collect it? A lot of it would feed back into damage control practices, modernization practices, and modifications of existing behavior. So you could tell a lot from the way a ship like Arizona was destroyed about where the weak spots in the ship were. Now, granted, magazine detonation will probably tear through most areas regardless of how strong or weak they are, but where the explosion had the greatest effect is obviously something of a clue as to which areas failed first. So in terms of damage control, it allows you to send out information like, this area is particularly vulnerable. We suggest you do this to make it less vulnerable, or possibly we suggest you maybe pay extra attention to assigning damage control crews to this particular area when you are hit in this vicinity. So, get these doors shut especially quickly, or make sure that there's supports for these bulkheads maybe pre-arranged, that kind of thing, which would go on to help obviously not just Arizona's data, but data from all across various US battleships. It also, not particularly with Arizona because it wasn't hit by torpedoes, but for things like West Virginia and California, the torpedo damage allowed a live, accurate assessment of exactly how powerful enemy torpedoes were, and therefore what upgrades or changes might be made to existing and proposed torpedo defense systems. You then have modernization guidance. So, if a ship's coming in for modernization, now maybe the ones that have been fished out of the bottom of Pearl Harbor, if you then can look at Arizona and say, okay, right, well, we're pretty sure an armor-piercing bomb went down through the deck here, penetrated here, exploded here. We don't want that to happen again because, well, look what happened to Arizona. Then you can then turn around and go, okay, well, in order to prevent that, perhaps we need more deck armor in this location. So when a ship goes into modernization, the armor above the magazines for the deck armor will be strengthened, and maybe a bomb burster deck will be added as well, because it's now been proven that that level of thickness of armor is inadequate. And then when it comes to modifying existing behavior, that doesn't necessarily mean the crew, but for example, once they've figured out that the large amount of black powder stored on Arizona was probably a significant contributory factor, that, for example, would accelerate the removal of significant amounts of black powder as a distinct magazine storage area, and the adoption of the newer shells, well, not the newer shells, but the newer cartridges or charges for the shells, which had small amounts of black powder integrated into them, which could then be stored in the other magazines. Because whilst it might seem a little bit paradoxical that things would be safer if you distributed black powder liberally through the smokeless powder magazines, the thing is each of those charges is individually considerably smaller, as opposed to, concentrating over 1,000 pounds of black powder in a single location, which then, well, it's rather obvious what that leads to if it gets hit. So it can drive changes in what equipment, etc., are deployed to the fleet to make things a lot safer as well. And I might as well take this opportunity to clear up something that people have been asking in that particular video about. Oh, well, I heard that the black powder there was for things like the aircraft catapults and signalling and so forth. Yes, the black powder stored there could be used for those purposes as well, but the amount of black powder that was needed for those purposes was far, far less than, the over 1,000 pounds that was present in that forward magazine section. And the great majority of it was needed for the propellant charges for the main guns. And so, black powder doesn't make a distinction when it detonates as to what its originally intended purpose was for. So it's a case of, if you see a document saying, yes, well, the black powder that exploded in Arizona's magazines was mainly for its aircraft launching catapults, it's partially right in that some of the black powder in there would have been used for that, but it's also wrong in that by implication that the black powder was solely for that purpose, because the black powder present for those kind of purposes was relatively minimal compared to the overall amount stored. And finally, Paul asks, in Descent into Darkness, Commander Raymer says one of his divers recovered a bomb from USS Arizona. He states it was a modified 15-inch shell from a US coastal defense gun, and the shells were sold to Japan long ago for scrap iron. He also states the bomb was sent to the Bureau of Ordnance for analysis. I find this claim highly unlikely because the only US 15-inch guns I can find reference to are the Civil War era Dahlgren and Rodman guns. However, from reading the memoir, I also do not believe Commander Raymer to be purposefully lying. Do you know if this story is true or not, or have any explanation for its origin? Since the Bureau of Ordnance is involved, could this all be another product of one of their cover-ups? So, here is an intact Type 99 number 80 bomb, which is converted from a 16-inch shell. Now, if you read the full description of what they discover, they find a shell that they say has stabilizing fins welded onto it. So I'll actually read the passage. So for context, they're actually exploring down to the second deck level inside Arizona, and one of the poor chaps falls into a hole. Extricating himself, he finds the hole's been made by a bomb, and so they trace the path of the bomb down through 2 more decks and find it in the walk-in meat freezer under hanging sides of beef. And the person who finds it says, he reported that the shell or bomb felt similar to the one I found earlier in the Arizona General Workshop, and I told him to bring the shell to the surface. Ben, that's the person who found it, rolled the 2,000-pound shell out of the freezer, and we used a chainful to lift it aboard the diving barge. It was a 15-inch shell that at one time had been used by old US coastal guns long since obsolete. The US imprint was clearly visible, stamped into the base of the shell. Stabilizing fins had been welded to its base in order to give the characteristics of a spiraling bomb. The old shell had been sold to Japan years before as scrap iron, and it had been returned to the USA with a vengeance. Ordnance experts came out, retrieved the shell, and sent it back to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, D.C. for analysis. As we watched them haul the bomb away, Martin remarked, "One thing's pretty clear. Japan must have been planning their attack on the US for years, or they wouldn't have retained old 15-inch shells instead of melting them down for scrap." So it is a bit of a paradox. The identification of the diameter is not too far off, because obviously these are adapted 16-inch shells. But, as you can see, this thing has stabilizing fins, not spiraled fins. The base of the shell is not visible, and these fins are obviously not then welded to the base of a shell. They've been given their own little tail cone. So, whilst the hole through Arizona and the finding of a bomb or shell at the base of it is consistent with what Arizona was attacked with, the description of the bomb beyond the fact that it is a bomb of approximately 15-16 inches diameter is not consistent with what you would expect. And, you know, the Japanese aren't going to make one-off shells out of, or one-off bombs out of truly obsolete American Civil War era shells and expect them to function. So what's going on here? Well, first thing you've got to remember is if a bomb has been through most of a ship, given it's fetched up in the meat locker, it's probably not going to look like this intact version. It's entirely possible that the whole thing has been compacted in, which might lead to the impression that the fins are actually attached to the base of the original shell rather than to a tail cone. Might also twist the fins, which gives them the impression that it might be a spiraling type bomb. And it might distort some other elements of the bomb that make it look slightly different. So the misidentification in that case is understandable. As for why it says the US imprint was clearly visible stamped on the base of the shell, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It may be misremembering, he may be conflating with maybe another shell that they found on the ship, but the Japanese never bought 16-inch shells from the Americans. They had no reason to stamp American, American English things into their shells. Maybe, again, because obviously this is written after the whole thing has happened, quite a few years after, maybe the US, maybe the Japanese pilots had written something or gone slightly beyond and maybe engraved something addressed to the US on their bombs, as, you know, all sides tended to do to various bombs. And the only thing I can think of is that perhaps, you know, having cast their mind back to remember these kinds of things, finding a mangled, what is clearly a naval shell, somewhat mangled, adapted into a bomb in the base of the ship, with some kind of writing in English directed towards the US, might then, over the time between that incident occurring and the book being written, have morphed itself into it's an old Dahlgren or Rodman 15-inch shell with fins attached to it. That's the closest I can come up with, to be honest. And that's it for this week on the Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Just a quick heads up. The next 6 to 8 weeks or so, you might see one or two more sponsored videos than you're otherwise used to. Usually you're probably used to seeing maybe one sponsored video out of given the 3 videos a week, probably once every 12 videos. You might see something like maybe 1 in every 6 might have a sponsor for the next few weeks. And, well, somewhat unsurprisingly, the trip to America is a little bit expensive, so I'm basically just looking to cover my costs there, but give you a heads up, and obviously also still will keep any relevant sponsorships relevant to the channel. You would not believe the number of emails that would like me to sell you food or software or all sorts of the regular suspects, and of course the inevitable Raid Shadow Legends promotion, but just safe from those, so don't worry about that. Alright, anyway, see you later, bye.